have been discussing this paper, Introduction to Philosophy, which is introduced in the UGCF NEP syllabus for the semester 1 students for the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. We continue engaging in the various themes that comes in this paper. Today, our engagement would be on the theme knowledge and belief. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. Now, the first thing first, what is knowledge or what is belief? Belief is when a person holds something to be true. For example, I may believe that it will rain tomorrow. Beliefs can be true, they can be false. On the other hand, knowledge is usually understood as true belief that is justified. Traditionally, philosophers defined knowledge as justified true belief. That means the statement must be true, the person must believe it, and the person must have good reasons for believing it. Now, this discussion about belief and knowledge comes under the domain of epistemology. Epistemology, let us revisit, is that branch of philosophy that studies knowledge and belief. It asks questions like, what is knowledge? How do we know? What justifies belief? What is truth? Just like there is epistemology, there is also the domain of metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that studies what exists and what really or reality is like. It asks a set of questions. However, the metaphysical questions are distinct from the epistemic ones. Some of the standard metaphysical questions are, what is real? What kinds of things exist? What is being? What is the self? The connection between epistemology and metaphysics is deep. Epistemology asks how we know reality. Metaphysics asks what reality is. But sometimes they come apart. We may question whether we can know what truly exists. Now, often asked question is where or when or how did episteme or metaphysics or epistemology develop? In the Western philosophy, the earliest fragments of episteme or doxa can easily be traced in the early Greek philosophy. The early Greek philosophers already did see a tension between episteme and metaphysics or knowledge and reality. Parmenides, for instance, argued that reality or being is unchanging and eternal. He believed that true knowledge must concern what is permanent and unchanging. The senses which show change and multiplicity deceive us. For him, metaphysics, that is what truly exists, determines epistemology, what can be known. On the other hand, early Greek philosophers like Heraclitus, by contrast, believed that reality is a constant change. If everything changes, then stable knowledge becomes difficult. This already creates a tension. If reality is unstable, how can knowledge be certain? The sophists, on the other hand, introduced skepticism. They questioned whether objective knowledge is even possible. And for them, belief might only reflect perspective or rhetoric. Then we see in the Greek philosophy, the early Greek philosophy stages, slowly the emergence of Plato and Aristotle. Plato made a strong distinction between knowledge, episteme, and belief, doxa. He argued that belief concerns the changing physical world. Knowledge concerns the eternal forms like justice, beauty, equality. For Plato, metaphysics grounds epistemology because the forms exist. Knowledge is possible. Without eternal realities, we would only have opinion. Aristotle modified this view. He rejected Plato's separate world of forms. He argued that knowledge comes from studying the structure of the natural world. He developed logic and systematic investigation. For Aristotle, metaphysics studies being as being, and epistemology explains how we move from perception to understanding through abstraction. Thus, in classical Greece, epistemology and metaphysics were tightly connected. Knowledge depends on the structure of reality. Now, that we have traced or shown how the emergence of epistemology or metaphysics had started in Western philosophy vis-a-vis the Greek philosophy, let us also see its Indian counterpart. In Indian philosophy, which has developed highly sophisticated epistemological systems like the Nyaya philosophy, where knowledge or prama is valid cognition. They identified different sources of knowledge or pramanas, and some of those included perception, inference, comparison, and testimony. Here, epistemology is central. They carefully analyzed what makes knowledge reliable. In Advaita Vedanta, metaphysics dominates. Reality is Brahman, pure consciousness. The world of multiplicity is ultimately Maya. Maya, in other words, can be something like appearance, though we do not have a apt translation for the word Maya as carried in Sanskrit. Ignorance is often translated as avidya, that causes us to mistake the world for ultimately being real. Knowledge or jnana is liberation. Here, epistemology is directly tied to metaphysics and soteriology, which is to do with liberation. To know reality is to overcome illusion. Similarly, there is also the Buddhist philosophy, where especially in Madhyamaka, we see metaphysics is deeply questioned. Nagarjuna argued that all things are empty, shunyata, of inherent coexistence. This had epistemological consequences. Our concepts do not capture ultimate reality. Knowledge becomes conventional rather than ultimate. Thus, in Indian philosophy, epistemology and metaphysics are strongly interconnected. Often, right knowledge leads to liberation from metaphysical error. Now, let us see the emergence of epistemology in the medieval period. In both Western and Indian traditions, metaphysics and epistemology remained intertwined. In medieval Christian philosophy, thinkers like Aquinas argued that knowledge of God and reality is possible because God created both the world and the human intellect. Truth reflects divine order. In Islamic philosophy, example Avicenna, metaphysics of necessary being grounds epistemology. Whereas in the early modern philosophy, especially in the early modern Europe, epistemology becomes central. Descartes begins with doubt. He asks, "What can I know with certainty?" He concludes that the one indubitable truth is I think, therefore I am. Here, epistemology grounds metaphysics. Knowledge of the self becomes the foundation for knowledge of reality. Locke, Berkeley, and Hume focuses on experience. Hume becomes skeptical about causation and the self. He shows that our beliefs about the world may not be rationally justified. This weakens the connection between metaphysics and epistemology. Immanuel Kant then makes a revolutionary move. He argues that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, noumena. We can only know phenomena, reality as structured by our cognitive faculties. This transforms the relation. Metaphysics becomes limited by epistemology. The structure of knowledge shapes what can count as reality for us. Now, going ahead in the 19th and 20th century, we see in German idealism, Hegel, for example, epistemology and metaphysics merge. Reality itself is rational and unfolds through thought. In phenomenology, Husserl, the focus shifts to how things appear in consciousness. Metaphysics is bracketed. The structure of experience becomes central. Logical positivists tried to eliminate metaphysics entirely. They argued that the only empirically verifiable statements are meaningful. Metaphysics was seen as nonsense. However, this view collapsed and metaphysics returned in analytic philosophy. Today, epistemology and metaphysics are deeply intertwined again, and this is the phase in our contemporary philosophy. In analytical or analytic metaphysics, philosophers debate realism versus anti-realism. Does reality exist independently of our beliefs? In social epistemology, knowledge is shaped by communities and power structures. In philosophy of mind, debates about consciousness connect epistemology and metaphysics. Is the mind reducible to the brain? If yes, then metaphysics constrains knowledge of self. In Buddhist-inspired philosophy and cognitive science, some argue that the self is constructed. This raises epistemological questions about introspection and metaphysical questions about personal identity. So when we connect the dots, we see that the connections between epistemology and metaphysics can be taken from three main forms, which is metaphysics grounds epistemology as is seen in Plato and Advaita Vedanta. Epistemology limits metaphysics as is seen in Kant, and that they are mutually shaping as in contemporary philosophy. Now, there are, of course, as much as there is a connect between the Indian and the Western, there has to be also a disconnect. The disconnection occurs when we say reality may exist, but we cannot know it, skepticism, or when we deny metaphysics altogether, positivism. The interconnection appears when the structure of mind shapes reality as experienced, or when the nature of reality determines what knowledge is possible. So we see that across Greek and Indian traditions, we see a recurring theme. Knowledge is not separate from being. If reality is eternal and unchanging, knowledge aims at permanence. Now, if reality is empty or constructed, as in our Buddhist school of thought, knowledge then becomes relational. If reality is structured by consciousness, knowledge reflects that structure. So, all in all, we see the themes where knowledge can be permanent when knowledge is taken as unchanging. Secondly, knowledge can be seen as relational, as when it is made out to be constructed, as in our Buddhist school of thought. And last but not the least, we also see knowledge as something which is defined by structural entity. Now, in Indian philosophy, especially epistemology and metaphysics, they are inseparable from existential transformation. Knowing reality is not merely intellectual, and I want to emphasize on this today, that especially when we think that a quick search in the net makes us knowledgeable, that is only equivalent to being information loaded, not really being intellectual. So, knowledge and intellectual do not necessarily go hand in hand. It changes one's being. So, if one is knowledgeable, the entire perspective, it changes. So, in modern thought, the relation becomes more critical and reflexive. We question whether our concepts shape reality or whether reality constrains our knowledge. Epistemology asks us how we know. For example, metaphysics would ask us what is real. Sometimes metaphysics determines epistemology, and many times epistemology limits metaphysics. Sometimes they develop together. So, from the Parmenides to Plato, from Nyaya to Advaita, from Kant to contemporary philosophy of mind, the two have remained inseparable. The history of philosophy can be seen as an ongoing attempt to balance our understanding of reality with our understanding of how we can know it. Indian philosophy is one of the oldest and most sophisticated philosophical traditions in the world. It developed rich systems of thought about knowledge, reality, self, language, logic, mind, and liberation. Now, we have to understand when we're talking about Indian philosophy that there are two main categories, the orthodox and the heterodox. Indian philosophy is divided into the orthodox schools, which is also called the Astika. Now, Astika doesn't mean that those who believe in the authority of gods, but rather Astik are those who accept the authority of the Vedas. Similarly, there is the heterodox schools called as the Nastik. And Nastik again are those that reject the Vedic authority. The distinction is not about belief in God. Some orthodox schools are also atheistic. About the orthodox or the Astic schools, we see that there are clearly 6 classical orthodox systems. Nyaya, for example, is the school of logic and epistemology, where Nyaya focuses on how we know things. It developed detailed theories of valid knowledge, pramana. It recognizes 4 sources of knowledge: perception, inference, comparison, and testimony. Nyaya philosophers carefully analyze error, doubt, and justification. They believe knowledge corresponds to reality. Their metaphysics is realist. The external world truly exists. There is also Vaisheshika school. The Vaisheshik school of metaphysics, realism, where they analyzes reality into categories such as substance, quality, motion, universals, and particularity. It proposes an atomic metaphysics. Reality consists of eternal atoms combining into objects. Nyaya and Vaisheshika later merge into a combined realist system. Sankhya, we have the dualism. Again, now in Sankhya proposes the two ultimate realities, which is Purusha or pure consciousness, and Prakriti, the matter or nature. Consciousness is passive and eternal. Matter evolves into mind and the physical world. Liberation occurs when consciousness realizes it is distinct from matter. We also have yoga, where practical philosophy of mind is the club it belongs to. Yoga builds on Sankhya's metaphysics but adds disciplined meditation practice. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras explain how to quiet mental fluctuations and realize pure consciousness. Mimamsa, on the other hand, is all about rituals and language philosophy. Mimamsa focuses on Vedic ritual and interpretation. It depends on the eternal authority of the Vedas and develops sophisticated philosophy of language and hermeneutics. Vedanta, on the other hand, is the philosophy of ultimate reality. Vedanta interprets the Upanishads, and again there are several sub-schools. The most famous is Advaita Vedanta of Shankaracharya. Now, Shankaracharya is only one of the many commentators of Advaita Vedanta. This is just a classic case where it shows that sometimes more than the principal author, the commentator becomes so magnificently strong through his debates and writings that he takes the front seat. So much so that many people mistake Shankaracharya to be the author of Advaita Vedanta. He is one of the commentators. Now, Shankaracharya did comment that ultimate reality is Brahman, which is pure consciousness. The individual self, Atman, is identical with Brahman. The world of multiplicity is Maya, appearance. Liberation comes through knowledge, jnana. Other Vedanta schools are not non-dualist. For example, we have Visheshta Advaita, which is considered or called as qualified non-dualism. We also have Dvaita, which is dualism. But the most prominent ones has of course been Advaita, and there are few more important ones under the Vedantic system. Now, under the heterodox or dynastic schools, we see that Buddhism rejects the idea of a permanent self or Atman. It teaches anicca, which is impermanence, anatman, no self, dukkha, suffering. So Buddhist philosophy developed advanced epistemology and metaphysics. Now, Nagarjuna's Madhyamika argues that all phenomena are empty, shunyata, of inherent existence. Reality is relational and dependent. Yogacara emphasizes the role of consciousness in constructing experience. In Jainism, we see that Jain philosophy teaches that reality consists of multiple substances, including jiva or souls. It emphasizes non-violence and pluralism, Anekantvada, meaning reality can be described from many perspectives. There is also the Charvak school, which is clearly the materialist and the skeptical school. It accepted only perception as valid knowledge and rejected religious metaphysics. The beauty of Indian philosophy is there are these various schools. One could be orthodox, one could be heterodox, but each of these schools deserves equal importance. As much as one could be celebrating Advaita Vedanta's Aham Brahmasmi as the core fact, there are also others who will equally be celebrating Charvaka's materialist school. And this makes the hybrid form of our Indian philosophy truly spectacular and magnificent. We will be discussing more about the key themes in Indian philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and so on and so forth in our next class. Thank you so much.